The beginning of the 20th century was shadowed by the violence and misery of war. It was in 1914 that Germany set into motion what was probably the most ambitious military plan in the whole of history. Never had so much faith by so many been put into one simple plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Before the outbreak of the war, the Kaiser instructed his chief of staff, Alfred von Schlieffen, to devise a strategy that would allow Germany to fight a war against the enemies she perceived to be surrounding her. Schlieffen died in 1913, but his plan remained Germany's only strategy when war broke out in 1914. Schlieffen's plan was based on the bulk of the German army attacking north through Belgium into France, and a much smaller force defending the Alsace-Lorraine borders in the south. But fatal mistakes made here on the border between France and Germany destroyed that plan. The stalemate that was to follow gave rise to all the horrors that we know as the Western Front. But what if the Schlieffen Plan had worked and Germany had defeated her enemies in 1914? Could then the 4 terrible years of the First World War have been avoided and the 10 million lives that it cost? And how would that have transformed the map of Europe and the subsequent violent history of the 20th century?
I think we'd have had a Europe which would have passed through the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s without communism and without Nazism. And we wouldn't have had a Second World War either.
In 1914, most experts were convinced that the war would be over by Christmas, and the plans of every European nation that sent its young men off to fight aimed to achieve a quick and decisive victory. The evidence of the naivety of those plans can be seen here in the mud of the trenches. For it was the failure of the pre-war planners that created the military stalemate that led to the Western Front. A massive killing machine. But nobody in September 1914, cheering the boys off to war, could have had the slightest idea that they were in fact sentencing those men to the mud and the squalor of the trenches for 4 long years. The man in charge of running Germany's war plan in 1914 was Helmut von Moltke. Although intelligent and capable, von Moltke possessed one critical weakness, an inability to stand up to the differing opinions of his junior commanders. This weakness was to fatally undermine Germany's armies and the Schlieffen Plan. The German plan was based on one unalterable fact. Von Schlieffen knew that Germany couldn't win a war on 2 fronts, dealing with the Russians in the east and the French in the west at the same time. To avoid this, von Schlieffen planned to take advantage of the fact that it would take the Russian railway system months to mobilize the enormous Russian army, much slower than the French.
Everything had to be crowded into the time available before Russia became a serious enemy on the Eastern Front, and he thought that was 6 weeks.
So for the Schlieffen Plan to work, a German victory over the French had to be swift and decisive. But there's a problem. Since their last war with Germany in 1870, the French had constructed a string of powerful fortresses along their common border with Germany. This is Verdun. By 1914, this is one of the most important of the French network of frontier fortresses. From behind these concrete and earthwork fortifications, the French could have stopped a German army dead in its tracks. Schlieffen knew that to capture positions like this could take months. Months in which the Russian army, fully mobilized, could have invaded and poured over eastern Germany. Von Schlieffen was sure that when war came, the French would not be able to resist invading Germany. So his plan set out that as the mass of the German armies rolled south through Belgium, here on the frontiers there would only be a token German army waiting. Their role was not to defend the frontiers, but to fall back and lure the French armies further and further into Germany. The Schlieffen Plan was nothing more than a huge revolving trap. In August, the main spearhead of the German army crossed into Belgium. The Schlieffen Plan had finally swung into action. The Belgian army was only about 1/10 the size of the invading German force and was swiftly overwhelmed. Several days after invading Belgium, Germany received the first blow to her plans. Britain declared war to defend Belgium's neutrality and to protect her own security. In 1914, the French army was commanded by General Joseph Joffre. His war plan was dominated by the deep French desire to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine, the provinces France lost to Germany after their last war in 1870. 80% of Joffre's army was to march into the lost territories, leaving only a relatively small number of men to defend the Franco-Belgian border. Although he didn't know it at the time, the French plan was exactly what von Schlieffen had hoped for. Von Moltke's two most senior commanders, Crown Prince Ruprecht and General von Kraft, had been placed in charge of the troops to fight the French forces on their frontiers. Like Schlieffen, von Moltke knew that the plan would fail if the French were able to move troops north to meet the bulk of the German army streaming through northern France and Belgium.
What has to be done to enable the German plan to work in 1914 is the French have to be stopped from manoeuvring away from the east to face north. And to do that, you've got to fight them somewhere. You've got to fight the troops that are in the east so that they're so fully engaged that they don't move to the north.
But as the French marched further into Alsace and began to recapture lost territory, so the demands to defend German soil increased. Ruprecht and von Kraft, determined to have their share of the glory, began to urge von Moltke for orders to counterattack the French at Morhange and Sarrebourg. On the 17th of August, after 3 days of intense pressure, von Moltke gave way.